In October 1964, an elderly man named Thomas Lindsey carefully locked the door behind him in a small office in suburban New Jersey. He had spent 45 years as a senior forensic auditor at the U.S. Department of the Treasury, handling the most sensitive investigations. That day, he officially retired after a lifetime of service and immediately moved to a tiny house deep in the woods of Vermont. He gave no phone comments to reporters from financial newspapers. He left behind no public memoirs and no articles in professional journals. He simply wanted to disappear forever into rural America. But 3 months earlier, something had happened that made the leadership of the Federal Reserve rush to call him a senile old man. Lindsey unexpectedly appeared at a closed annual dinner of the New York Society of Certified Public Accountants. Someone in the audience asked him a completely routine question about methods of concealing bank reserves during the Great Depression. Thomas slowly walked up to the central podium, remained silent for a long time, and then said a sentence that brought a graveyard silence over the banquet hall. "You are still studying the economics textbooks they ordered you to print in the 1940s, but for some reason, none of you has ever checked the old archive safes of the Smithsonian Institution. None of you has asked exactly where the leather folder with the code designation Project Shark, November 1920, disappeared to. It was the main secret ledger of the House of Morgan, and I personally held it in my hands for 2 weeks, a document whose data the government of the United States never entered into any official report, because that book proved that our entire financial system belonged to one man. After that, Lindsey was politely asked to leave the podium, and the chairman immediately declared the evening closed. Official representatives of the financial conglomerate and the Federal Reserve still call those statements the fantasy of an exhausted old man. But believe me, ordinary market economics has absolutely nothing to do with this. We are used to sincerely believing that government banks and tax agencies carefully monitor every cent in the country. But if you start digging into the timeline of so-called technical cleanups in the National Archives, a frightening truth comes to the surface. The most important financial documents of the 20th century do not vanish because of simple mistakes or careless clerks. They are removed by direct order of people who very much do not want us to see how the global banking machine is truly built. This is the story of what was really recorded in the secret accounting ledger of 1920, and of the last living auditor who managed to balance those books before the pages were hidden forever in concrete bunkers. If you, like me, want to get to the real mechanisms of power hidden behind boring numbers, take a moment. Subscribe to the channel right now, and be sure to hit the like button under this video. It costs you nothing, but the algorithms will understand that people need deep historical investigations like this. Every like from you is one more lantern lit against the coming darkness of corporate oblivion. If you're with me and ready to look behind the curtain of Wall Street, light yours, and let's go down into the Treasury archive. Thomas Lindsey spent more than half of his long life among those yellowed folders and dusty boxes. The official story, the one you will hear today in any economics department, sounds as academic and dry as possible. In 1913, the Federal Reserve was created in the United States, supposedly as an independent regulator that saved the country from crises. For decades, officials have insisted that private bankers answer to the government and operate strictly within the law. They show us polished charts, inflation tables, and congressional hearing reports, creating the illusion of total control. But in his personal diaries, which his grandson miraculously preserved and digitized, Thomas Lindsey describes a completely different reality. Those records clearly show that Washington's government agents were always nothing more than an obedient front for private capital. The main archive repository on Trinity Place in New York is not an ordinary warehouse of old papers. It is a multi-level underground bunker with armored doors, armed guards, and an extremely complex system of coded clearances. You physically cannot simply walk in, open the first box you see, and take financial records for review. Every movement of every document is recorded in several control logs on different floors at once. And if a folder disappears from that perfect system, it means only one thing: it was erased deliberately. In September 1952, Lindsey was transferred to a special closed sector investigating anomalous transactions. He had been recognized as the best analyst in reconstructing old bank transfers, a man who could trace hidden gold flows through indirect tax records. He was assigned to find assets that major corporations were hiding in offshore zones across Europe and Latin America. His main task in the new position was the complete review and cataloging of old documents being brought to New York from powerful banks. These were the archives of institutions from the first half of the 20th century that had officially ceased to exist after the World Wars. And then, on one rainy autumn day, two massive boxes made of thick cardboard and tied with heavy twine landed on his desk. They were sealed with old wax impressions that no one had dared to touch for more than 30 years, ever since the First World War. They had no standard inventory numbers from the tax authorities, but the personal ink stamp of John Pierpont Morgan, Jr. was clearly visible. Next to it was a short handwritten note: Project Shark, Main Ledger, November 1920. According to procedure, Thomas was required to check the document line by line, create a digital catalog card, and record the condition of the pages for federal storage. What he found on the very first pages of that enormous leather-bound ledger made him lock his office door from the inside. He instantly forgot about lunch break, instructions, and safety rules. Reading through the perfectly aligned rows of entries, the book was filled in the flawless calligraphic handwriting of the House of Morgan's chief accountant, who had recorded every hidden deal. It did not track ordinary commercial loans, but secret stakes in the capital structures of the world's largest industrial enterprises. These documents had never been photographed onto microfilm. Their frames were completely absent from departmental catalogs, hiding the truth from auditors. The numbers themselves literally overturned every assumption about the real balance of power in the American economy, industry, and politics. Beginning in November 1920, right after the end of the First World War, when public attention was focused on rebuilding devastated Europe. It was at that turning point that the House of J.P. Morgan began a large-scale operation to secretly absorb the key industries of the United States. The book documented in full detail, and with references to shell trusts in Delaware and foreign funds in Switzerland, transactions worth hundreds of millions. All settlements were made exclusively in pure gold, bypassing standard banking clearinghouses and Treasury oversight agencies. Judging by those entries, Morgan had full and unilateral control not only over the nation's steel mills and iron ore plants. It listed controlling stakes in his direct competitors, including Rockefeller and Rothschild structures, consolidated into a single pool. But the most frightening and astonishing material was hidden on page 34, where closed political transactions were described in detail. It recorded enormous sums connected to the financing of election campaigns for top officials and U.S. senators. The ledger proved that senators, Supreme Court justices, and even 3 American presidents in a row received regular fixed payments. The money came directly from Morgan's hidden accounts through shell law firms in London and Paris. In return, These people obediently passed laws that allowed Wall Street bankers to legally avoid any tax audits. They fully freed the syndicate from government oversight of reserves, shaping legislation that was controlled by them and beneficial only to them. Among the documents, Lindsey discovered original receipts for the transfer of physical gold, bearing the signatures of famous figures. These were signatures of people whose names are carved today into granite monuments in Washington and printed in textbooks. Thomas was especially drawn to a secret memo pinned to the December 1920 balance sheet by the banker's personal secretary. In it, Morgan's chief analyst directly advised beginning an artificial and gradual restriction of the nation's money supply. The bankers were consciously preparing a massive liquidity shortage that 9 years later would explode into the devastating Great Depression. This allowed them to buy up the bankrupt industries, railroads, and farmland of an entire continent for pennies on the dollar. Thomas Lindsey, understanding the colossal danger of the discovery, worked through the night, carefully redrawing the ownership structures of the trust. By hand, he copied the key transaction numbers and safe codes into his personal locked work notebook. He placed the leather ledger in a high-security safe, sealed it, and went home, firmly determined to report everything to his superiors. But he never got the chance. At exactly 8 o'clock the next morning, internal security officers entered his office. They appeared without knocking, accompanied by armed federal marshals, and blocked every exit from the building. They silently presented Thomas with a warrant signed personally by the Secretary of the Treasury, authorizing the immediate seizure of the materials. All papers connected to Project Shark were to be confiscated on grounds of the highest and most absolute state secrecy. All his drafts, personal notebooks, and even his work pen were packed into thick plastic bags for destruction. Morgan's ledger was removed from the safe, loaded into an armored case, and taken away in a guarded special vehicle. Thomas was strongly advised to forget the incident forever if he wanted to keep his job. The head of security stepped close to him that day and said quietly, "Lindsey, you're an excellent tax specialist, but you climbed into the basement where the blueprints of our country's very foundation are stored, and there is no way back from here. The financial reality you saw in that book has officially never existed for the public. Those are merely old working drafts from private attorneys, and we are disposing of them under a special classified protocol. If even one number from that folder reaches the press, your career will end in a federal prison with no right of appeal. And unless I'm mistaken, you have a wonderful family out in the suburbs and a little boy growing up. Think about your loved ones." It was then, in the early 1950s, that the U.S. government, together with the biggest bankers on Wall Street, developed a global program. It was called the Optimization and Modernization of National Archives Program, and it served as the perfect cover for a purge. Under the pretext of transferring documents to new microfilm and saving fragile pages from the damage of time, the destruction of evidence began. Thousands of original ledgers, cash books, and agreements from the beginning of the century were secretly burned in furnaces or dissolved in chemical solutions. Historians and economists were given carefully edited copies in which every inconvenient name and every shadow transaction had been completely erased. Instead of the real story of the creation of the Federal Reserve, we were handed a beautiful patriotic fairy tale about free market competition. We were told about brilliant American industrialists who built a great nation from scratch with their own hands. But the original documents that could have been used to conduct an independent audit and prove the global collusion of private bankers disappeared. They turned into gray ash, depriving Americans of the ability to learn who their country truly belonged to. Thomas Lindsey remained silent for more than 30 years, dutifully performing his duties and avoiding the attention of internal security. He waited until his official retirement in 1964, and only then did he decide to take the first step. But before his death on his farm in Vermont, he managed to give his son a cassette tape with a voice recording. On it, he dictated in full detail the ownership structure of the House of Morgan and the codes to secret Swiss bank accounts. He told his son, "The greatest lie of our century is that economic crises happen by accident because of market cycles. Every crisis, every depression, and every wave of inflation is planned by specific people in the silence of closed offices on Wall Street. They do it with ledgers like these, artificially regulating the flows of gold and cash. They erased the originals, replaced them with false statistics, and now they control the world while we argue about stock prices." Official representatives of J.P. Morgan Chase still state that Project Shark and the secret 1920 ledger are fiction. They call these stories the fantasies of radical left-wing activists and conspiracy theorists with no evidence. And Thomas Lindsey's personnel file in the archives of the Department of the Treasury is now completely locked and classified with no right of disclosure. But the deep underground vaults of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York still stand in their place in Manhattan. They descend dozens of meters into the granite bedrock, guarding the secrets of the global financial elite from outside eyes. To understand the true scale of this shadow operation, we have to look into the closed protocols of the Monetary Policy Committee for 1933. Those documents mysteriously disappeared right before the congressional hearings on the famous Glass-Steagall Act. In those papers, there was mention of a secret audit conducted by an independent accountant from Chicago named Arthur Anderson. He was the first to discover that the real gold reserves of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York did not match the official Treasury reports. The discrepancy was enormous, amounting to almost half of the entire declared national gold reserve, a massive quantity of precious metal confiscated from American citizens under Roosevelt's directive, had disappeared. It was not sent to the government vaults of Fort Knox, as the official newspapers and radio broadcasts of the time claimed. The gold went directly into private vaults on Wall Street, replenishing the personal reserves of Morgan's banking syndicate. Anderson documented that the gold was booked as collateral for so-called non-redeemable clearing certificates between banks. The House of Morgan issued these papers to its Swiss subsidiaries in order to create an artificial shortage within the gold standard. When Arthur Anderson tried to send copies of those balance sheets to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, something irreversible happened. His personal car was found completely burned on the outskirts of Illinois, and Anderson himself disappeared. All of his work archives for the previous 3 years were immediately confiscated by the tax service under the pretext of an urgent audit. Government agencies carried out a brilliant operation of semantic substitution, rewriting the country's financial history from the ground up. They removed every mention that an entire nation's gold had been used as private collateral. This mechanism of automatic report falsification worked so flawlessly that not a single economist could detect the catch. For half a century, primary cash orders and transfer acceptance records were destroyed immediately after the annual balance was completed. The entire American audit system, which today is presented as a model of transparency, was originally built under the control of Morgan's lawyers. The only purpose of this reform was to hide the real beneficiaries of global economic crises and shocks. The most prestigious accounting firms in New York received enormous grants from banking foundations to develop standards. They were tasked with creating new reporting standards that legally allowed major corporations to conceal assets. They did not show their real offshore accounts or secret ownership stakes in other companies on official balance sheets. As a result of this century-long conspiracy, we received the modern financial world built on virtual obligations. Today, trillions of dollars exist solely as digital entries on the servers of private investment banks. The real material value of national currencies, once tied to gold, has been completely destroyed and turned into a myth. When independent analysts today try to request a full inventory of the U.S. gold reserve, they are refused. The government always responds harshly, citing commercial secrecy laws and the sovereign authority of its agencies. They completely block any attempt at civilian or independent parliamentary oversight of the money-printing machine. The Morgan corporate empire cleaned the archives so professionally that today's generation of brokers believes in fairy tales. They sincerely believe the Federal Reserve protects the interests of the state and is not a private enterprise. And if today you try to find even one original physical negative or cash ledger, you will run into a wall. They will politely show you terabytes of perfect digital video or scan tables of retail payments to distract your attention. They will show you bond payment charts, creating the illusion of absolute archival openness that raises no suspicion. But you will never be able to verify exactly where 40 million ounces of pure gold went on the night of November 12th, because the pages of the main ledger where that accounting was recorded were irreversibly destroyed in industrial shredders. They were destroyed by direct order of men in plain clothes who personally supervised the disposal process in the basement. Thomas Lindsey understood perfectly well what kind of catastrophe for humanity this global substitution of real value with digital codes was leading to. In his final note, which he hid in a secret compartment under the wooden floor of his house, he left a warning. When the last auditor who saw Morgan's original ink signatures dies, financial slavery will become the absolute norm. A new generation of people will study stock quotes on phone screens without understanding how the system is built. They will argue about interest rates without realizing they are arguing over numbers inside someone else's private program. America's true freedom burned in the furnaces together with the ledgers of 1920, and now we are only obedient little gears. We serve a machine that pumps wealth in one direction, stripping us of our future and our independence. And that gray ash of the burned financial archives is the highest price the nation obediently paid for comfortable blindness. Official textbooks will continue to claim that the Great Depression happened because of ordinary mistakes by stock exchange leadership. Millions of people will firmly believe that the money in their bank accounts is safely protected by the government and backed by the strength of the economy. But the stone silence of Manhattan's underground vaults guards very different secrets, secrets capable of bringing the system down in a single moment. And the original leather folder of Project Shark still invisibly remains present in this story as the main reminder, a reminder of exactly how the entire world was robbed of its true wealth and freedom. The traces of this global deception cannot be completely erased because the laws of mathematics do not know how to lie for the benefit of bankers. And our main task is to keep searching for these hidden analog inconsistencies among the yellowed pages of old books. We must compare the balances and ask uncomfortable questions of those who are used to ruling unchecked in total darkness. The conclusions from this story, as in all previous episodes of our channel, are yours alone to draw based on logic. Thank you for digging down into this frightening financial depth with me, and for not being afraid to look behind the curtain of Wall Street. Subscribe to our channel, Be sure to leave your detailed comments under this video and turn on the notification bell. Every like and every thoughtful response from you is a direct strike against that monolithic wall of corporate oblivion. Protect your thoughts from outside influence. Never trust perfect economic reports on the screens of your devices, and I'll see you next time.